Pytel doesn't know won't hurt us.
I think Sarah's trying to tell us we're on the web and on YouTube.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Well, it's time. I think we can get going. We're welcome to the Code of Conduct Subcommittee meeting, Subcommittee of Council Services. And the members of the committee, I could see you all. I could see Councillor Hamilton, the Vice Chair, Councillor Knapp and Councillor McKean. We're also joined by Councillor Cartmell. And I don't know if we're joined by anyone else. If we are, can you let us know?
Mike.
Welcome, good morning.
I regret that decision.
So I don't hear anyone else, so I think that's everyone. So we've called the meeting to order. Roll call, I can see you all. I just need a motion for the adoption of the agenda.
So moved.
Thank you. Any additions, errors we need to do? Seeing none come up, I will call the vote. Please vote on the agenda.
I'm a yes.
We have all the votes.
And display the votes, please. And that is carried. Thank you. Selection of items for today debate. Well, we only have one, so I'm going to deem that selected. We don't have any other items, no request to speak. I don't know if we do councillor inquiries. I've been given no notice of one at this meeting. So we might as well jump right into the reports. And I understand there is a brief presentation from the Integrity Commission. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And we are joined by our Integrity Commissioner, Ms. Pytel, and our Ethics Advisor. I think he's with us as well.
Yep.
All right. Please go ahead.
Well, good morning and Happy New Year. The memo that you have before you is a bit of a conversation starter, to say the least. And it's not something that's been done consistently across Canada, but it's on its way. Now, when you're thinking about the proposal to bring in guidelines around social media, what I encourage council to do is look at or imagine this as if it's also in the public square, as if it was a public meeting. And that's a good analogy because in those public meetings where you would have a town hall meeting or some way to communicate with your constituents, it's a way to get information out and get information back. What you wouldn't permit, though, is unlimited and abusive communication, somebody dominating the mic, dominating the conversation. There could be a protest. There could be a demonstration. That happens, and that can happen on social media. But I think my view of this is that this tool needs some boundaries around it potentially. And we've already talked about, and I've talked about in previous meetings about the boundaries that the code provides to councillors. And there's some other guidelines that I've put in for discussion in this memo. But I also believe that for this tool to be working effectively, council could consider putting some consistent boundaries on what they will or will not accept on social media on their official council sites. Now you have your separate sites and your constituents can have their separate social media pages to say whatever they please. And there are laws, defamation laws, et cetera, to deal with. This to me is a tool that can be used effectively or can be abused and can be shut down or hijacked. I also have what may be a different perspective on the elected officials' role, and that is, yes, you're elected officials. Yes, you need to have a thick skin and you need to take the criticism. But I also think you've got a job to do. And if using this tool to communicate is preventing you from doing your job, or if you're unsafe at your job, you're being abused at your job, then I think it's fair to put some boundaries. The media do this, like the global CBC, whatever, they put boundaries on their social media sites. This is not your constituents' personal site. It is the public forum where they're coming in to communicate. And so some people may be worried about this shutting down the democratic process. I'm actually worried about the opposite. I'm worried that this tool, if there aren't some guidelines put around it, and if it's improperly used, then your constituents cannot speak. They cannot get a word in edgewise because the social media pages are being hijacked, so to speak. And so I think of it as a tool, and it is the modern day tool that we can't ignore is there. I'm not worried about it shutting down democracy. I am worried about the reverse. I'm very worried about, and Councillor Nicol, I think you're on the line. You've used the language to me that people go on social media and they shout you down or shout people down. And that is a problem when when you need to get your jobs done. And so when I and I'm not going to read my memo, but the memo talks about boundaries going both ways. And my concern is about the activity on this. And so when council thinks about using this and instructs their staff, think about your activity and think about the messaging and think about consistently managing these sites. And so what I did is I did a ton of research in the US and Canada to figure out what elected officials or how they're dealing with this. There isn't a lot in Canada. There's a lot in the States. And so I mirrored a bit of what I put in this to what would be defensible in Canada, I think. Consistently treating people the same way is important. It seems minor, but it matters. So if you're we want at the end of this, if you're going to do this, you'd want a set of rules that your staff or you can follow that are consistent within the code of conduct. So I'm getting all kinds of complaints. I have another one in my inbox about councillors blocking again, and they're not letting this go. So if there are consistent rules to say, look, the integrity commissioner, the ethics advisor, council have decided these are the boundaries that we're going to put around this tool. And they're not to shut down democracy. They're not to shut down the councillor's ability to communicate. But they are there to provide a safe place a safe-ish place for your constituents to exchange information with their councillors. Now, I've put in some concept there, and I'd be happy to take questions on this. I've suggested that you have to take the criticism to a point. And I've tried to put some boundaries in there, but this isn't the beginning of a discussion. And I don't live in your world. I'm just here as an advisor today because my office is not just to investigate, but to also advise. So I would be thrilled to get feedback on some of the concepts that I've put in here or get questions on them. And I do think that eventually, if council wants to go this route, I've tried to build it in a way that I think is defensible and that I would feel comfortable if I got a complaint saying, no, the councillor followed these rules, off we go. This would obviously have to be vetted legally as well through your legal department if council decides to go through something like this and put something in place. So with that, without reading everything I've put in here, I'd be happy to get feedback and answer questions on this memo.
Thank you very much. And we'll have a few questions of you and see where we're going to go with this. And we're going to begin with Councillor McKean. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Bev. And Jamie, I wanted to clear one thing up for me. In previous discussion, it was sort of like, well, communications in social media are different because it's kind of the wild, wild west out there. So if I say something as a councillor that seems a bit unseemly or unparliamentary, it's only because of context. And my view on this is communication is communication is communication, and you could be held to libel laws if what you say on social media is considered to be slanderous or libelous. Just your thoughts on that, and then I wanted to talk about blocking, but that first.
Well, and so you may recall, Councillor McKean, that I had asked council to take defamation out of the code.
Right.
So yeah, so the laws of defamation and slander and libel and all of that run parallel to the code, and they are private remedies available between counselors, whoever, this is available to members of the public. I get that.
Let me put this a bit of a different way then. If the code says, in a nutshell, that preserving and protecting the esteem of the office of city councilor or the mayor are part of the code, and you seem to be in your communications to be demeaning that, would that not apply whether it was in a letter to the editor, in a speech to the Chamber of Commerce, or in a tweet? Aren't they all held to the same code of conduct standards?
Yes, and so council's held to the standards in the code of conduct, and I'm not sure I'm understanding your question, but I can say this, that I've seen other councils have to deal with councillors who are defending defamation lawsuits because the councillor has apparently defamed somebody, and councils had to deal with that in terms of the councillor's activity being potentially defamatory of somebody and somebody bringing a claim against them. I think I asked the question badly, Jamie. Yeah, no, obviously I'm not getting it.
All communications is communications according to the code of conduct. Doesn't matter where it's written, it's spoken, right, or it's in social media. They're not treated differently because social media is this wild, crazy place. You're not given more license because of that.
Right, and so that's exactly my point.
Right.
And so in my world, the tools are going to change. Like, we didn't have Instagram before, we didn't have this or that. It's not the tool that's used, it's what is said. And if it's about your work, if it's about council, then yes, then it applies. And so I like to ignore the tool, but yeah, and I agree with you. People think that anything should go in every direction because of social media. This is a step in a different direction. And I'm making this clear that not everybody's going in this direction, but I'm saying, let's try to take a step in a different direction. It shouldn't be anything goes. You've got the code. I think your constituents should have some boundaries around how they engage you without limiting them being able to have an opinion.
So the other sort of thing that jumps out at me is the ability for one of us to block someone on social media, which I have tremendous sympathy with this, having gone through this, not so much of late, but I think there are scallywags and mischief makers and trolls and jerks who enjoy trying to get under your skin. And so I blocked one of those. They raised the issue with you. So I almost wonder if we couldn't have Brent on retainer. He's on retainer, and I say, Brent, could you have a quick look at this? And he gives us advice on whether we could block somebody.
Well, and so I don't see a problem with that. And so a lot of so Brent and I have a split role, but we're both advisory. Now, some of the integrity commissioners publish these bulletins instead of this being a policy, it's published as a bulletin and an interpretation. Absolutely, you can be going to Brent. Absolutely, you can be coming to us and saying, "What about this category?" That's the advisory function.
Right, because I think it could be difficult to make where does somebody cross a line will be perhaps difficult for us as individuals. So we might need that help. I'm out of time. I'll stop there. Thanks, Bev.
Thank you. We'll go to Councillor Cartmel now.
Thank you, Councillor Essingler. I'm happy to defer, but happy to take my turn. I got a number of questions about this, and frankly, not about really that the code extends into social media and that councillors ought to be held to account regardless of where they're communicating. I really just thought we should make it clear that code of conduct does extend to social media accounts. My questions are around this notion that of the official councillor account. And so I'm going to use myself as an example. I've had social media accounts, LinkedIn, for instance, that go back 20 years. It's my name. It's my face. They're accounts that I created to, at the outset, to participate in public discourse and to promote my company. When I decided to run for council, I used those channels and my suite of contacts to run for council. When I was successful in getting elected, I used those very same channels to communicate out to people that supported me, to people that didn't support me in my work as a councillor. Now you're saying that I no longer own those accounts, that they're official accounts, that they're not my accounts, that it's not my face, that it's not my name, and that I can't use it for campaign activities. But they're the exact same channels as they were before. I understand that I am now, because by virtue of being elected, that I have to watch my words and watch my activities. But to say that, maybe I'm going to take a different tact at this. I think the premise is that in the ordinary conversation out in the world, people cannot necessarily distinguish between when I'm speaking as a councillor or when I'm speaking as a candidate or when I'm speaking as a citizen. And so all of those things, all of those ways in conducting, I'm still subject to a code of conduct, no matter who I'm acting, whatever person I'm putting on when I act. And that makes sense. But from the same vein, saying that there are questions I can only answer on this account and other questions I can only answer on that account does not follow the same logic. Either I am all of those things all of the time, or I'm only those things some of the time. So if the logic is that the code of conduct applies in every utterance that I make, then it should equally follow that I am a candidate during the writ period, so to speak, in every utterance that I make. So I struggle with that. I guess I wonder if we're going to talk in the world of official city social accounts, then maybe we need to create official city accounts that councillors have control of when they're elected and lose control of once we start the election period. So maybe for instance, the Twitter account for Ward 9 says City of Edmonton Ward 9 and doesn't say Tim. I just struggle with this idea that somehow I developed all of these ways of communicating with my community, my circle of friends, my social circle, my circle of supporters. But because I got elected, now you own it. I don't quite.
No, and that's not what the intent is. And so official might be the word, not the right language. And I was even sort of struggling with that. So there's going to be, and Brent's going to be advising on that in terms of what you can or cannot do during a campaign. And so what I'm talking about is content. I'm talking about, and so some of these other policies that I've looked at, they've created ways for you to separate out what you just described during a campaign and then put it back in. And so those are separate rules that we need to talk about in terms of what is allowed during an election campaign. That's tomorrow's discussion, I believe. But today, I'm talking about the content. When you're talking about your activities as a councillor, when they're interacting with you as a councillor, then on these, and maybe official, I agree with you, official might not be the right word, but it's about finding that forget about the account and think more about the content, because it could be on a completely personal account that you could be offside the code.
Oh, but so I'm going to run out of time. I completely agree with you on the content. It's this account ownership thing that I'm worried about. Yeah. I've got 20 followers. I can't regenerate that in the next 3 weeks.
Of course. Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'll just follow up with the next questions. Because we already have a code of conduct, I am struggling with if we need a social media policy here, because would that not be enough? And why do you feel that we should look at it different? My understanding is its origin came in because the number of inquiries or complaints you're getting, and so you recognize maybe there's some area to help here. So that's the one that I was struggling with. And the other questions I have is, we haven't really seen many examples in Canada at the municipal level. I wondered if there's any at the provincial level, and if maybe we're doing this too soon because we don't have a lot of experience out there. So those are kind of my rambling questions for you, if you could kind of jump there.
So at the municipal level, there has been some threatened lawsuits in the States, or pardon me, in Canada, that have been resolved without going into an actual courtroom on this. I've talked to some of my other integrity commissioners, and they have draft policies that they're looking at putting together. And so again, this is for discussion. It's a way of interpreting the code, partially, but it's partially a way to respond when I get complaints about blocking that say they're disrespectful, they're this, that, and the other thing. It's partially a way of interpreting the code and building that piece out. When I'm getting consistent complaints about your use of this tool and it being contrary to the code. And so I could do this ad hoc, and I could say, well, in this situation, you're offside the code or you're not. I think this deserves some discussion in terms of what councillors can and cannot do. Does it need to be in a policy? Not necessarily. It could just be in a bulletin. It could just be in a guideline. But I do think it's easier to point to that than to constantly, and this keeps coming up again and again, to constantly be going example by example, rather than having a set of guidelines. At the other levels, what happens is the political parties, some of them have these guidelines, some of them don't. Some individual MLAs and MPs have published their guidelines, like some of the councillors do. And municipally, it's just on its way. So we don't have to do this right now, but I am seeing that people are working on these policies, and I'm seeing some drafts from other jurisdictions because of this problem. And is it a huge problem? No, it's something we may not want to get ahead of. It's also about providing a safe environment for the councillors, and that's your business, not mine, right?
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that, because when I read the notes, blocking seems to be the biggest issue that you're faced with right now. But then I had other questions. What about misinformation interpretation, and how do you judge that? Then, but we do have the code, so maybe it's there. I'm not sure.
Well, so the code deals with misinformation by councillors, but councillors are free to correct misinformation on their social media sites if that's coming in the other direction, right?
Yeah, okay. That's kind of my musings, but there's a few more. I think we have Councillor Knack on the first round. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And you were just headed right where I was curious. So, because I read through it, and there were a lot of the guiding principles that made a lot of sense. There were a few that I had questions about, not unlike I think Councillor Cartmel was raising. So if I understand correctly, what you've primarily been getting as complaints relates to either blocking misinformation or just respectful conduct by people on social media. Are those sort of the three? Would those be the common themes that you would be hearing about in terms of concerns raised to you?
The common theme is blocking, and then manipulating, I guess, or preventing that communication, obviously. And then we know just generally that there is abuse coming in the other direction, and so other elected officials are putting in boundaries so that they can not be abused as much as possible.
Perfect. So if that's the case, so we could, there's two, in my mind, there's sort of two approaches we could take. We could take those things that you've just talked about and embed them in the existing code of conduct, or create a social media piece and sort of reference it in an addendum or another bullet point in the code of conduct that this is how specifically some of the rules related to social media, and then anything else that we might have questions on or uncertainty on, that can always be set aside and revisited at a later time if there's not sort of general agreements. would those sort of be the two mechanisms, either just embed it right in the code of conduct or reference it in the code of conduct and have a pager that talks about here's the rules around blocking, here's the rules around respectful conduct towards elected officials as well?
Well, the reason it might work better as a policy is because these things are changeable and having to change the code constantly. Often what you see as these codes of conduct are around longer, in other jurisdictions, they will publish their code and then the integrity commissioner or the advisor will put in an interpretation section into the code. It's not part of the code, but it's an interpretation within the code. If you see that's a bit of a hybrid between the two options that you just described.
Okay. Yeah. So that's helpful. I mean, in my mind, I can see the need absolutely to make it clear, to have a clear policy related to how we can block and why we would block, sort of that piece there. Similar to Councillor Cartmel, not that I'm opposed to a separate conversation about how you might separate out accounts or have different accounts, but I'm not sure that's a problem we need to solve today. Only because, frankly, we haven't. I mean, there's been some elections since social media has come into effect, but this would be the first one where we have social media and an existing code of conduct. So I'm not sure trying to solve that on the fly is the right piece. But from what I hear, again, we could revisit that later based on what happens. And in the meantime, we could solve the bigger issues, which is folks not having the opportunity to communicate in various platforms with elected representatives. So there'd be nothing stopping us from taking your documents you created and sort of pulling out the guiding principles that we think are need to be immediately worked on, like blocking, and then setting aside maybe some of the other ones. Do you have any?
Right, and I think it is a separate conversation about campaigning, and I'm also getting lots of traffic on that right now, and people concerned about using city resources or mailing lists and that sort of thing. I'm getting tons of queries, complaints about that. So, we're in the season. We're going to need to address that, and that's going to be part of tomorrow's discussion, I believe.
Yeah, because we have some rules in the code of conduct around something like a mailing list. So if we have our mailing lists from like our websites, they can be used up to May 31st. At which point, then they're sort of reset, or if they're set aside in place of specific campaign correspondence. We still have to answer some questions around the social media piece. I understand that. Okay, I'm just trying to make sure I wanted to sort of identify which problems are the ones we need to deal with today, and I'm wondering if we can deal with the blockings in particular and that respectful conduct in particular, because I think those two make a lot of sense. Misinformation should already be addressed in the code as long as we reference that the code applies to how we act on social media too. Okay. Those are all my questions, and then maybe I'll think about how you would craft a motion to break out those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Knack. And it looks like I have Councillor Cartmel next.
Thank you, Councillor Esslinger. So I note in point 11 of the attachment 1 that there's a note there that says if council wants the ability to convert an official account for use during a campaign, guidelines can be provided. So I would just suggest that those guidelines ought to be provided. And under what the circumstances. And following up on Councillor Knack's comments, mailing lists that are developed through a council office or using city resources for campaigning, I think that's completely understood. And if there's any doubt, I completely 100% endorse those restrictions. Completely get that. I've got another thread of question here, and I'm quite trying to find the exact wording. I can't quite find it, but there's advice about who councillors might host in an open forum or in a discussion, that there's a risk of being seen to endorse an opinion that is offered in that way. And I get that. 100% I get that. Here's my question. There are some on social media that will create a parody account to, in the world of satire and through comedic effects, criticize individuals and councillors. That is a commentary effect. I'm fine with that. there are those that will use very uncomplimentary language around counselors. In fact, there's one that published a webcast about a week and a half ago that described counselors in language that I've only ever heard on construction sites, and not even then. And so my question is this: I understand where you say that following those accounts is not necessarily endorsing. Does participating with those individuals tantamount to endorsing, and then endorsing that activity? So if a person is on social media and using very uncomplimentary language about one of the counselors, and then a counselor goes on to or participates in a webcast or an interview or some other activity with that person, is that tacit to endorsing that activity? If a counselor follows a parody account and not a legitimate account, but a parody account that is clearly has a clear mission to simply mock and denigrate a particular counselor, is there a concern about that? I get that following Donald Trump doesn't mean you voted for Donald Trump. Are there other examples where we might need to apply another lens here?
Yes, and Councillor Cartmel, you've identified some of the parts of this memo that I'm, struggling with a bit. Now, I didn't say endorsing in terms of retweeting and sharing. If you have somebody on, and that's more, maybe it doesn't belong in these policies because it could be more of something that the electorate can decide, right, in terms of who you put on your social media site. But again, if it's a site that's used for communicating with your constituents, that's where I get interested. So I'm not saying you're endorsing them, but where I've seen cases and other stuff I've done for other jurisdictions is councillors getting something sent out by somebody else that's hugely disrespectful of another councillor, for instance, and they just keep sending it out saying, well, it's not my content, for instance. So I can abuse this councillor on social media by just retweeting somebody else's tweet, which makes me Teflon. And that's drawing attention to the fact that you could find yourself outside the code if you start abusing somebody else or doing something offside the code by saying I've created this one level of removal, or one bit of separation. That's what I was trying to get at there. And I'm even a bit concerned about putting something in about being responsible for other people's speech on your site, because you can't control somebody necessarily once they're on. So that one I'm a bit gray on, to be quite honest.
Me too.
Yep. No, agree. Yep.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Councillor Zadok.
Thank you. Just a couple quick questions. So, one, why would a councillor block someone trying to engage on their social media, in your opinion? To the Integrity Commissioner.
So in the memo that I put in front of you, the reason I would say that blocking would be fine, and it should be commensurate to the crime, so to speak. So if they're literally just shutting down the conversation or promoting hate or doing things that prevent you from getting the message out or prevent other people from participating in the dialogue, and so that they're the bots, they're the shutting down of this democratic tool so that councillors can actually communicate. It's like being at a public meeting and somebody just shouting over you constantly instead of letting everybody participate. Here's your 5 minutes with the mic. All right, you had your chance to tell me you don't like what I'm doing and what you think of my how I'm doing my job. Fine. It's a crossing over the line into something that shuts down this tool for communicating.
Okay, so I think we can agree on that. I certainly can. But what's the area in between then? So why would you block someone that's not being outright hateful? If we can agree that there's cases where blocking is warranted, it would seem to be a negative just to block someone that's just interacting in a constructive manner. And often there's hundreds of comments on social media posts, or at least in the dozens. And I just don't know why a councillor would actively block people that aren't outright being completely disrespectful like in the line of contributing to the conversation. Like, I think if you look at a social media feed and it's all positive comments about what the council is posting about, then it's suspicious that maybe, there's been people excluded from the conversation, which could be its own problem. But is that the main problem? What's like sort of just more exploring this gray area in between, please?
Well, the complaints that I'm getting, and there was a lawsuit, I believe, in Ottawa that ended up getting settled because the councillor unblocked the person. It is really around constituents saying their freedom of expression and their democratic rights are being limited by blocking. And there are certainly cases in the U.S. that say, yeah, you cannot block. This is the modern means for people to show up and give their opinions. And yes, they should be able to give their pretty pointy and sometimes not very pleasant opinions to a point. I would say, and then to a point where it becomes inciting hate, being personally abusive or threatening to you, where, I'm going to come and cause you physical harm, not I'm going to run against you in the next campaign because I don't like you. So I don't think it's super gray in the sense that people are saying, this is the way we get to communicate, and you're taking away my ability to receive and participate in this conversation that you've just described. So that's why they're upset with being blocked, because if you just disagree with the person, that's the code challenge that I'm getting. People should not be able to block just because they disagree with you or what you've done.
Yeah, I can't see a councillor blocking someone that just disagrees with them, as long as they're disagreeing respectfully. But so it sounds like it's a bit of a decorum issue, and I want to just explore a bit of a parallel. If a councillor is hosting a town hall meeting, they can be exclusionary in who's invited, one, by the means that they notify people, perhaps through email. You're not emailing everyone in your contacts. That would not be wise or warranted. But you might be doing a crime hall on policing, and you're going to email people that want to have constructive conversation about policing, but you might think that you might choose who's coming. You want to be informed into however the situation is. I won't role play that, but it's you're going to try and create the situation for meaningful engagement in a town hall meeting, a real town hall meeting. But if you're not, if there's a troublemaker coming up or someone that you anticipate could be offside in their conduct, you might not want them to attend. Can you just respond to that?
Well, I think that's a little difficult on social media, and it can even be difficult in person. What I've put as possible thoughts is whether you would limit or be able to limit, and this is out there, the amount of contribution people can make, and if they're off topic, knock them out of the conversation somehow by muting as opposed to blocking them. But yeah, I think on social media, you're going to get people weighing in differently than you would in real life, for sure. In that way, where at a private event or an event where you can control the invite list, there may be some differences there for sure.
One last thing, I know my time's not on, but I imagine I have another minute. Just on this sort of using discretion, really to discriminate in a way who's receiving the message. I actually don't do email blasts. I've done one or two before, like with a newsletter attached. I choose not to. So my engagement is sort of more in the public through social media, which is available for everyone. People in China or wherever could log on and see that. It's just the nature of the internet. But it occurs to me that at least a method that's been around since as long as email has been popular is that councillors might just choose to send an email blast. And if you ever made the mistake of supporting a political party once or twice, you'll know how many of those you get at other levels of government. But it's a selective membership of who receives your email blast. So while social media is an interesting thing to talk about, and I do agree that it's a bit like the Wild West, as Councillor McKean was saying, it seems that we have more traditional forms of engagement that would somehow be exempt from the intent of these rules. Not that these rules would apply to email blast, even though that's sort of social media. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm just trying to like tease this out. And I'm in favor of a social media policy in principle. It's just I want to make sure that there's no unintended consequences. So just the question is around being selective in a mass email or a newsletter distribution. Or even if you mail a few constituents Christmas cards, you're not mailing it to everyone. You know, what are your thoughts?
Well, it goes back to Councillor McKean's comment about communication is communication, and I do get complaints that I dismiss out of hand all the time about emails, private communications. It really just has to fall within the four corners of the code for me to get involved, Councillor Zadek. And if what I'm saying, the difference between the selective meeting versus these sites is these are seen differently in the sense that people feel they should be able to access the information that's available on your Twitter account. They just do. And so if you were to approve a policy or just have us tuck something into the code, you're going to get questions. You're going to, why isn't this a free for all? Well, this is why. Right. And so I think you need to be very thoughtful. That's why I'm having this dialogue on why you would, as opposed to right now we just have everybody's got a different set of rules. Everybody's staff members a different set of rules. And the answers are not cohesive in terms of how this council looks at things. You can or cannot go this way. It's, as I say, this is a dialogue. It's meant for discussion, but I think right now we're just going to continue to get complaints, whether it's, I haven't got an email blast complaint if you're asking me that, but I could. I'm not sure on what basis. It would have to fall within the jurisdiction of the code for me to get involved. And people are finding creative ways of squishing it into the code, by the way. The latest one is they think there's a conflict of interest in the way somebody uses their social media platform. So.
Thanks.
Councillor Knack.
Thank you, and yes, Councillor Zadek, I've signed up for all of the email updates from all of the parties just to try and stay in the loop. That was a bad idea, especially at the end of every quarter. Whew. Anyway, so I think based on all the questions I've heard here, so I'm wondering again and trying to direct it for myself. It would sound like what I'm thinking about is essentially a motion that would say, yes, develop a social media policy that specifically relates to the blocking of individuals. I'm sort of looking at your first series of guidelines, maybe, 1 through 8 or so, or 8 or 9, which really focus on when it's appropriate to block people, the expectation that we have of people who are engaging with us as well, which is sort of kind of tied into that. And then there may be separate conversations about the other pieces, but would that help address what you've primarily been hearing then, based on all of the conversation we've had today? Or are we missing anything that sort of that you've been hearing immediately that you'd like more guidance on?
So some of what I put in here is based on my own experience, but also what's coming up in other jurisdictions. So I've thrown some stuff in for consideration to be a bit proactive in the sense of accepting a gift for that kind of stuff, and that fell into the conflict of interest. But I did a bit of research and pulled out what some of the something that may come up in the future, just to be a bit proactive on it. We may not want to deal with that today, but it's there for your consideration. Primarily, it's the blocking issue. You're right.
Yeah, and I forgot those last few make sense too. I mean, not that I imagine we're getting a lot of requests to be social media influencers and paid by brands to advertise. For some reason, politicians aren't great, social media influencers, or at least to sell fun products. Okay, so if we did that and then sort of left the question, because it sounds like we've got a separate conversation coming around appropriate use of social media related to elections, that there's a separate conversation happening around that. There were a lot of questions I heard today. We could set that aside for now. to have that separate conversation and then figure out what the right, there already may be a series of guidelines that are going to be provided to us in the form of a bulletin specific to that. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, and I'll defer to Brent on that because I think that was going to be his presentation tomorrow. But so to be clear, social media, the code already covers social media.
Yeah.
But then there's that whole section on elections as well, and that's so we've kind of divided up the work. So I did the social media piece, and Brent's doing the elections piece, and obviously I'll weigh in on that as well. And I've seen some stuff that's going on in other jurisdictions around that, but I'm not sure if Brent wants to answer that question.
I think you're muted there. Still muted, I think. Oh, coming back. So I guess in the meantime, while we're waiting for him to come back, so we could simply make a motion saying develop a social media policy specifically in regards to the blocking of individuals who interact with members of council, and then you could pull from the guiding principles that you've designed which ones you think apply to that versus which ones might be a separate body. So because I worry if we just said go develop a social media policy using all of the guidelines you've written here, that enters into territory that maybe there's not full agreement on and a full appreciation of how we would do that. So would that just be enough direction to, I guess this is more to admin, to develop that?
Well, I would say the first question is, do you want a policy or do you just want us interpreting this, right? And so policies, because if you're offside the policy, you're offside the code.
Yeah.
In a nutshell, right? So that's question one. Do you want a policy or not? And if so, then let's take a look at what's going to be in that policy.
Okay. I think Brent is back. It looks like he's unmuted. Well, I'm out of time, so why don't I get off and we'll wait on that since there's others back on the board.
So I'll go to Mayor Iveson next.
Well, good morning, folks. I've been listening closely while monitoring a couple of other things as well, but good discussion and good questions. I guess one question to Ms. Pytel, and thanks for the background work on this, is in your interpretation, and I think you've established this as sort of, maybe precedent is too formal a word, but as sort of a clear interpretation from your perspective that social media is included in all communications. Would it be redundant then for us to make code amendments to explicitly mention social media, or would it be helpful if there isn't a separate policy? Would it be helpful for clarity to make explicit that the code pertains to social media expression as well?
Yeah, the code talks about, just in the communications section, it says your communications on social media are governed by the code. Here it's about activity. It's about the interaction between councillors and their constituents. And that's where the code is being challenged, so to speak, Mayor Iveson, in the sense of it's not just that social media applies to communications, but it is also in the way you use that tool to communicate, and so it's that blocking piece. I'm sort of loath to put blocking right in the code because there's going to be other things that go on, so I'm loath to put it in the code, but people are pushing the boundaries in terms of what should or should not be acceptable communication techniques by their council members, if that makes sense. And I'm not sure I answered your question, but the code just, as I said, deals with saying, if you're doing it on social media, the code applies if you're communicating. Just to be clear, other codes aren't as clear. So integrity commissioners first have to say, and by the way, it does apply. Thankfully, whoever drafted this code and the drafters of it in the first place put it in there already.
Oh, okay, so it is explicit. Unfortunately, I think some ambiguity entered in council's debate about whether to uphold the sanction, about whether it ought to apply to social media. So I think that's maybe one of the reasons why we're here. But if the code already says, well, if the code does say that, and if that continues to be your interpretation, then I think we can leave it at that. I think there was a good discussion this morning about sort of the occupational health and safety side of this for elected officials, which I think are a real set of considerations. But I think there are the democratic questions about the expectations of the public to be able to access their elected officials. And so I'm wondering whether, if there is to be a policy enumerating these things, whether we might take metrics, targets, and outcomes approach. For example, requiring reporting on and disclosure on the number of folks who have been blocked, because I think that would be, if there is to be discretion allowed for people to do that in accordance with either a shared policy or a requirement that each of the 13 of us maintain a policy, that some reporting on how that's being deployed, the number of folks who are blocked in total, as well as the number of individuals who've been blocked in a certain period of time, for example. I think that would be relevant information for peers to see, as well as for the public to see. In your research, has there been any noteworthy example of disclosure requirements around limitations, blocking, that sort of thing?
No, I haven't seen that, Mayor Avison. What I've seen is just the focus on, because, for instance, one person could end up having to block more than another because they're just being attacked by a group. So it's more along the reasons of why people blocked, the reasons as opposed to the volume of blocking. I haven't seen that in anything that I've looked at. No, I struggle with that a bit because I'm not sure if the metrics tell the story. For me, all I would be concerned about is whether it's compliant with the code and the interpretation of it. Now, I've put in the code, or in the suggestion, though, that if, for instance, somebody only blocks somebody from a protected group, right? So I only block people from the LGBTQ community, I would be concerned about that, and I would look at that from a code perspective. So it's really about content as opposed to volume, because the volume may not tell the story. I appreciate, and I've had this comment made to me by one of the members of council, what about just manipulation of social media for political reasons, like, making yourself look more popular. I'm just saying it like I hear it, and there's nothing in there that addresses that right now. That's really that's something for council to discuss for sure if you want to go that far. It's not covered by the code right now, and I haven't seen any other draft language on that in any of the other jurisdictions.
Well, I take your point that it's perhaps the context and nuance of why blocking is happening that would be particularly noteworthy. But I do think volume would tell a story as well, and would be of interest to the public as a pattern for tracking. But I'm out of time, so I'll leave it to others to see if there's interest in that.
Thank you. We'll go to Councillor McKee.
Yeah, I don't know how much I'll really add to this, except that I wish for a code of conduct that elevates civil discourse and makes that clear in the policy that elected officials are being held to a standard of civil discourse, and that in doing so, we will also ask that of our citizens, and that we're trying to raise that. And I think politics is one of the worst places, and I don't mean at the municipal level at all, where the worst of us is shown to the public. And I think it's high time that we subscribe to elevating the discussion, talking about what's really important, and that character assassination is pushed away and blocked, perhaps, if that is the intent of the person on social media to attack character of whomever, that there should be consequences for that. And as far as blocking, some sort of, like I asked earlier, I'm not sure I want to make Brent richer, but if we were able to reach out and say, this, look at, can you have a look at this, what this guy's saying? And I feel justified in blocking him, and you could get a little advice from Brent. And then maybe you have an appeal process in there as well, or for the citizen who could reach out perhaps to you, Jamie, and you do a quick and dirty look at it and see whether you agree or not. And if the appeal is upheld, then the person gets returned or is unblocked, whatever it is. But I think the spirit of the code of conduct was to elevate and remind us of the importance of civil discourse. And so the spirit of that seems to me was intended to be included on social media, but maybe needs to be stated more explicitly. And that in holding ourselves to that standard, we also ask that of other people who are participating with our accounts on social media. Jamie, I just want your thoughts on whether that, maybe we have to be, I know we have to get really technical and legal sometimes, but I think if that's not already implied in our code of conduct, that extends to social media and all participants, then I think that's what we need to see.
And so I'm comfortable that our code is explicit on the counselor side of things, right? And it's black and white, it's there. And Brent May, I think he's back on now. He and I had a bit of discussion about this because my first draft had something that was a bit more of what you're saying, Councillor McKean, in terms of the decorum. And I took it out in the sense of making it something that's really more around hate, really more around abuse, really that bad stuff that is activity that's abusive or that's a bit further down. And there are going to be gray lines here for sure in terms of where it stops and starts. Trying to give you a tool where when I get something like this, you don't have to go to me or Brent, or when your staff get this, you can just go and put it through and say, I'm documenting it this way and I'm blocking. And so for the most part, if it would come to me and you say, look, it fell under that. Now, getting back to it, also what Mayor Iverson was saying is that if something's looking kind of hanky and people are just shutting down democracy, shutting down the tool, and clearly, from a volume point of view, that I guess would be helpful. That's the sort of stuff I'm getting. I'm getting this person every time you disagree with them, they block you, and then I can't even see what they're saying, so I have to go the other route to find out what's going on. So you can see where I agree with you, Councillor McKean, but I don't know how much you can sell it. I also, looking at the U.S. cases on constitutional challenges, I was trying to be very careful on how I crafted this so that there wouldn't be a constitutional challenge to it. Be clear, I'm not giving legal advice, but I can't help but be a lawyer sometimes.
Well, I'm interested in what others have to say, but I would just hope that our aim here is to elevate discussion in and around politics. And maybe that's me being naive, but what the hell? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McKean. I just wonder, Brent, if you could respond as well, because I think you're going to talk about the election, and I think any of the discussion about official Twitter, maybe it comes up election, but maybe it goes from the beginning of the next cycle forward so that there could be official sites if that's the way it is, because I have the same concerns as Tim, but maybe you could speak to that. Brent, are you with us?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, sorry about that. I tried to log out and come back in, and then everything went foobar. So I'm glad to be back. Is it my turn to comment?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, yes, there are specific rules with respect to the election, which we're going to talk about tomorrow at a lunch and learn. It would appear to me that the normal communicative principles that currently apply to all councillors with respect to prohibitions against offensive or intimidating behavior or disrespectful behavior, and that applies, of course, to other candidates or to other councillors or to constituents. I mean, they apply equally during an election campaign than as they do during the normal course of the legislative year. I mean, there are additional requirements of councillors during an election year with respect to the use of city facilities, city communicative devices, city e-lists, which you've already talked about today, and we'll go through that in a little bit more detail tomorrow. And one of the discussions that I hope to engage tomorrow is how those additional layers of responsibilities affect a sitting councillor versus non-incumbents, because we can't, I think, force a situation where we have an unlevel playing field, especially when it comes to communication, where a councillor is bound by the code of conduct with respect to respectful communication and no offensive comments on social media and otherwise, and non-incumbents, challengers, may not be bound to that same level. I mean, obviously, they're still bound to the laws of libel and slander and the prohibitions against hate speech, but we need to have interpretation with respect to communication to level the playing field between incumbents and non-incumbents. Now, with respect to the larger issue that we're talking about today, with respect to a social media policy, I mean, I think the Integrity Commissioner, I think, has set it out quite well, very well. I caution you to move slowly. In many ways, Edmonton would be ahead of the curve if it proceeded too quickly with respect to social media policy. You will hear from constituents that they think they're being muzzled. I mean, another euphemism, or I guess a synonym for blocked, is censored, and I think you need to be mindful of that. That being said, of course, no politician or no individual should be subject to offensive or hateful speech. It's just to try to find the balance, and I'm always really cautious when you try to have a social policy with respect to things like communication, because as you can all appreciate, words like offensive or disrespectful have no real objective benchmark to which they can be measured against. What I might think is offensive, you might not. So my advice is to proceed cautiously, and that's not to say not to proceed, but to proceed cautiously.
Thank you very much. I guess that kind of echoes my thought. I wasn't sure that we needed to go here yet. Whether we want to add to it, I think the blocking is the issue. And the other pieces, maybe it's a future discussion. So, but I'll listen, and I think we'll go to Councillor Burkett next. Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Councillor. You know, I'm listening to this conversation very avidly. I've been on social media for over a decade, as most of us have, and basically seen it all. And aren't we really talking about the way that we wish things were versus the way they are? Because even if we implement rules in our code, someone breaking those rules isn't breaking the law. So the enforcement is an internal enforcement. We already saw what happens when we try to hold someone to account. So I'm just wondering about this, like, you know, any guidance on that thought would be very helpful.
I'm taking from your question, Councillor Paquette, is what would I do with something if I received a complaint saying somebody had actually violated the policy, and you look at it and they had violated the policy? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, and then the end result is there aren't really any consequences. Just that person gets elevated and gets a big stage and spotlight to claim grievance.
Well, and so I think that's something for council to consider. It's your code. I'm just helping to enforce it. Here, what I'm suggesting is some of the stuff that's coming forward is not outside of the realm of let me put it a different way. So Brand said the constituents, you will get people objecting to this, and I think you will, because it could be misunderstood as trying to suppress, as opposed to the opposite of this. And so if I see people pushing the democratic process and using the guidelines in a consistent and reasonable way, as an integrity commissioner, I can step back from that and I can say when these things come in, I'm not investigating that. This is a decision for council to make whether they want to put more boundaries in terms of how these tools are used. I think we have to be super careful with that because you're right, Councillor Paquette. There are only so many things you can do with respect to limiting what other councillors are doing on their own social media site. I'm comfortable with what the code says now. How the council chooses to sanction if something comes forward is a council decision. I just make recommendations, and it's almost irrelevant to me, but the actual code, I think, is functioning well in that respect. And it's written in a way that I'm proud to be the one that actually interprets this code.
I agree with you completely. I think that my concern is that there are folks who they don't want to play by rules of decency, and they can claim that their disinformation or misinformation is simply a matter of opinion. And so it's really, at that point, it becomes the choice of the electorate on whether or not to reward or punish someone rather than counsel. And I'm just trying to, it's a tough conversation because there are no clear answers here and there are no clear consequences.
So to be clear, with respect to the code, a violation of the code is a violation of the code, whether there's sanction or not, right? So, and so I can find a violation of the code whether there's sanction or not, and that's what I say. The sanction is separate from what I do. Brent talked earlier about there being gray around offensive and that kind of language. That's not in the guidelines that I've put forward for that reason, because it is difficult. I'm putting forward the really more the ones that are easier yet still gray sometimes to wade through. And I've been very clear, and other integrity commissioners have been clear as well, that simply disagreeing with your constituents and shutting them down is not okay, just because they disagree with you, and that's definitely a trend across the country. And so many integrity commissioners are interpreting their codes as saying, if you're blocking people just because you disagree with them, that could be a problem. I think it's better to spell these things out a little clearer for council so they're not inadvertently caught by the code, by being given a bit more guidance in terms of how I and Brent may interpret that code is the purpose.
Yeah.
Part of
it just seems it's made for people who want to be good actors so they don't stumble or cross a line that they didn't intend to. But it's not really a lot we can do for people who intentionally don't care and they will willingly cross those lines. So that's where council's decisions on how to sanction come in, but we don't really have a lot of teeth. So I guess I'm just, this is a very difficult conversation because we are relying on people to act in good faith. And I guess I'm out of time.
Thank you. And we'll go to Councillor Knack next.
I think I'm based off all this, I can probably just make a motion that would be along the lines of that the Code of Conduct Subcommittee, we have to recommend to council services that administration develop a draft social media policy to address the blocking of people on social media. I think I got that right from a governance side. We have to recommend to the committee, I think. Is that correct? Yeah, I've seen nodding heads. Perfect.
Yes, that's correct, Councillor Knack.
Yeah, so that would be the motion I would make. And just briefly introducing it, what I heard today was, I think that blocking seems to be the primary issue that we need sort of more of a immediate resolution on, and that's why I've written it that way. There were a lot of good questions by other members of council about the unintended consequences of other actions, and sort of heeding Brent's advice. It would be best to address this issue, which is the one that has most primarily been raised. There may be a need to add to that in the future. There may be a need to adjust things in the future, but I think if we go beyond that right now, I don't know how to craft that or the direction to provide at this point, and I feel that would not be wise. So that's why I didn't include anything else, but if there are any questions, happy to answer any of those, but just focused on the blocking of people from accessing information on social media.
Thank you very much. And we'll go to Councillor Cartmell. That motion is made. Maybe it's reaction or more questions. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Just one question to Councillor Knack. Are we equating muting with blocking, or strictly blocking?
Just strictly blocking. I based off what I read in the guiding principles, there is a difference between those two. That might be referenced in the policy. I don't want to. I think there might need to be some definition built into that so we can make it clear, because I think it's fair. What I read in the guiding principles is that it's fair to mute people for a variety of reasons, even ones that might not be defined as what was in those guidelines, whereas blocking should require a very set, you've done these things and that requires you to be blocked.
I think it's just worth an explicit statement that says either this applies to muting or it does not apply to muting, and with those, perhaps with those definitions that you're suggesting.
Yeah, that would be, I like that. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. We have the motion on the screen now.
And Councillor Knack, a few details to confirm with the motion, and one of which is which committee you would like this to return to, if it would come through Council Services Committee or back through a Code of Conduct meeting, subcommittee meeting that could be scheduled.
Well, I mean, either are technically committee meetings, so I'm fine with it going, the draft policy going to a Council Services Committee, because it's gonna end up going there anyways, and we usually have capacity and bandwidth to deal with that. But if anyone has other feelings, so in the meantime, my default would be Council Services Committee, have it go back to there.
Okay, thank you. And just speaking to this, I'm hesitant to go forward with any of this because I'm not quite sure. But the blocking was the issue that has been identified. So I'll support it going forward to a draft, because maybe we'll have some more information then. But at this time, that's where I'm at. Cautiously supporting it moving to the next level. Not sure we want to invest a lot of time in it yet, but. And I have Councillor McKean.
Thank you. I just wondered about the routing here and whether this delays things a lot, and if there wouldn't be a way. So really what we're asking here is for the administration to prepare a draft social media policy, and that would probably end up at Council Services Committee next, I would think. I just wonder, am I misreading what I'm seeing on screen here, that it has to go to Council Services Committee and then to the next steps, or?
Is that a question to the mover or to?
Yeah, perhaps first to you, Andrew.
Sure. So my understanding is that, so we couldn't make a recommendation to council. So it is a bit of a governance piece. We have to recommend to Council Services, and then Council Services has, and I think the wording is there now, has to recommend that to council. So I don't think there's any way around that. So, but then the draft policy would come to Council Services, not this subcommittee.
Well, in a word, ugh. But okay. And yeah, I will support this measure because I think I'm satisfied from Ms. Pytel's answers earlier that the spirit of the code of conduct in regards to the behavior of city councilors in all their communications, including social media, is already in the code. So your blocking does seem to be the critical issue here. So yeah, I'll support this and hopefully not talk again. Thank you.
Promises. We'll go to Councillor Hamilton next.
Thank you. I've been listening to this really carefully because I've been listening to this discussion really carefully, which is why I didn't ask questions. I'm still not inclined to support the formation of guidelines around this, and for a couple of reasons. I don't want to speak for anyone else's experience on social media, but my experience has been a very large amount of bad faith questions. I've had the experience of having people ask somewhat sexually explicit questions over email and then using social media to further that harassment. And having to document that and legitimize that kind of bad faith questioning and that kind of harassment, to me, is sort of an unnecessary humiliation that I don't think my fellow counselors would enjoy enduring. So I have a pretty nihilistic view of social media that has frankly been validated in the last month or so. And not having the ability to control access of people to me when I'm in my home. And I think that's one of the very disconcerting parts of social media. It's very intimate. You can be sitting with your family at a picnic and someone can send you a message that completely changes what is happening. And that is not having control over that, to me, is disconcerting as a counselor. And I understand that there's other things going on, but at the end of the day, it's already, I find, a really tenuous place to be a part of. I don't particularly enjoy using the tool, though it is essential to being in public life these days, but not having to legitimize bad faith questions, having to legitimize harassment, discrimination, and racism to by and large anonymous people is mentally and emotionally exhausting, and I can't justify using my time or any of my staff's time to do that work. So I'm not inclined to support this, not because the work the Integrity Commissioner has done is at fault, but because I think it is the Wild West, and it's trying to be, in some ways, the one good man, in a bad town, so to speak. It's my perspective on it is that this is aspirational, and I love these kinds of conversations, but in practice, the internet is a dark place, and I want to have the ability and license to protect myself and my staff and my family, frankly. So that's I won't be supporting this today. And if it goes forward, I won't be supporting it then either. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Councillor Cartmill. No, that was from before. Okay. Did you have something further, Councillor Knack? The list is gone. I thought you were on.
Just to close whenever we're ready.
I guess I'll speak to it before he's closed. Just Councillor Hamilton's comments remind me, or give me pause. I was a little uncomfortable going in about doing something. I certainly want to respect that this is the challenge we're having, but I don't think I was uncomfortable going forward, so I don't think I'm going to support this either. I think if we have social media already in the code of conduct, it's there, and maybe there'll be a future time for this conversation. I'm just not sure it's yet. And I'll go to Councillor Knack to close.
Thank you. So, and this will be hard because I actually completely agree with what Councillor Hamilton just said around her ability and any person's ability to not have to be the one to constantly relive those experiences. I realize I have been very fortunate that I have not had to deal with nearly the same type of things that Councillor Hamilton had to deal with, Councillor Esslinger, other people in our city. So I would hope, and that's why I wanted to do this and let a draft be created, because in my mind, there are two very separate notions of blocking. There is the one where somebody is just trying to prevent somebody from accessing information or providing a dissenting view that has been respectful. And that I have a major concern with when people are allowed to block, especially at a time like this where we're not able to gather in the same way. So you've got people who that is the only way they're trying to get information out to the people they represent. And then they could be blocked simply for offering a dissenting view. And I think that's a concern that needs to be more clearly defined. But I would hope that in a draft policy, there is a way to differentiate between the example that Councillor Hamilton just raised. Because I absolutely agree with her that she should not, nor should anyone else, have to constantly defend themselves or keep a running documentation of just every single hateful or derogatory thing they have ever received. Because again, having not had to deal with that myself, but having heard what many others have had to deal with, that would not be acceptable. So that's why I would say it would still be worth creating a draft policy to see if there is a way. And I'm not going to claim that's going to be an easy policy to write to make that difference. But I would hope that if we were going to proceed, and I think we still should, that those two very different scenarios are separated out in the policy. That would be my ask. That was really the intent. So, and I worry that if we can do that, then I think we can actually deal with the very serious issue of people not having access to the information of their representatives just because they might be having a different point of view. Again, I don't know how it could, maybe it can't be done. Maybe there is no way to adequately address that in a draft that would prevent, that would create that scenario that we've heard. But I think we need to have that conversation. I think we should actually create that draft. Again, my intent is something has happened. Sorry, my screen just went blank. Anyway, I think I've said my piece there. I would ask that committee support this just to allow the draft to be created. And if there's no way to accomplish what has been rightfully flagged, then we shouldn't proceed. But I'd hate for us not to try and miss out on dealing with something that is coming up quite often. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Sorry, I'll turn on my mic. I will now call the vote on this matter. Please vote.
We have all the votes.
display the vote. And that is carried. Thank you. Is there any notices of motion? Seeing none, it's a good body of work for today. We are adjourned. Thank you.